A city built on the current. The harbor was no longer silent. By the early years of the 18th century, New York's waters churned with the rhythmic creak of masts and the hollow echo of ship bells. The fog that once whispered across Mannahatta had become heavy with the scent of salt, fish oil, wet rope, and faraway spices. Here, where the Lenape once fished in quiet canoes, fleets of Dutch, English, and even French vessels now anchored, each one heavy with tea chests, sugar barrels, silk bolts, and ambition. Down by the wharves, the city was in motion. Slaves hauled crates while merchants barked orders and scribbled ledgers. Children darted between wooden carts, chasing one another through the maze of linen and leather. Foreign tongues mingled with thick colonial accents, forming a chorus of trade and tension. The once wooden paths of New Amsterdam had become stone-paved arteries, pushing goods and people through the heart of a growing empire. At the center of this mercantile machine stood the custom house, where men in powdered wigs and brass-buttoned coats tallied the lifeblood of the city, trade. In the backrooms of taverns and counting houses, fortunes were made and broken on parchment. An invisible currency moved with every agreement, trust. For in this young city, gold was king, but reputation was gold's shadow, and just as valuable. The East River, once a boundary between tribal grounds, had become a thoroughfare of commerce. The tides bore not only vessels, but ideologies of capitalism, of ownership, of dominance. This was no longer the island of the Lenape, nor the quiet fort of the Dutch. It was becoming something else entirely. It was becoming New York. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the streets still glistened with sea mist, the city whispered of its destiny, to rise not through conquest, but through commerce. The counting houses and the quiet power. While the docks roared with movement, another kind of empire was quietly being forged inland, within the thick-beamed counting houses that lined Broad Street. From the outside, these buildings appeared modest, brick facades, green shutters, iron knockers that echoed hollowly when struck. But inside, behind ledger-covered desks and candlelit halls, the heartbeat of the city's fortune pulsed steadily. Here sat the merchants, not the loud dockmasters or sweaty traders, but men who understood numbers like priests knew scripture. Their religion was calculation, their altar the ink-stained ledger. They dressed plainly but moved with the confidence of those who saw futures no one else could. These were the silent kings of commerce. By quill and wax seal, they connected New York to the Caribbean sugar plantations, to London's tea rooms, to West African ports in the shadow of misery. They invested in ships they never saw, backed expeditions they would never join, and ensured cargoes so valuable that a single storm could bankrupt a dozen men. Yet they smiled, sipped Madeira from crystal, and watched the maps on their walls like a general surveys the battlefield. One such man was Elias Broom, a name now forgotten, but in his day he was known as the banker without a bank. With only a desk and a ledger, he orchestrated deals that rippled across oceans. He believed wealth was not in coin, but in connections, and built invisible bridges between sailors, slaves, sugar, and silver. His office smelled of parchment and lavender oil, and on its walls hung no portraits, only maps. The city's future was being written not only in ships, but in silence, in the scratch of a quill, the flicker of a candle, and the handshake of men whose word weighed more than gold. Ships of silk and shadow. By the early 1700s, the piers of New York had become more than just wooden arms stretching into the river. They were arteries pulsing with ambition. Merchant vessels, their sails patched and proud, arrived with the rhythm of tides, each one bearing stories told in spice, silk, and secrets. These ships were not mere transporters of goods. They were emissaries of empire, floating symbols of reach and risk. Painted hulls bore the scars of distant storms, and in their holds the wealth of continents mingled in fragrant confusion. Chinese silk wrapped beside Dutch cheese, barrels of Caribbean rum sweating beside crates of English linen. At the helm of this oceanic ballet stood the captains, part sailor, part gambler, part diplomat. One such man, Captain Willem Drakens, was said to have dined with sultans in Morocco and evaded pirate fleets in the Bay of Bengal. His ship, the Crimson Swan, had a figurehead shaped like a weeping angel and was whispered to never return from a voyage with the same crew it set sail with. He traded in everything, textiles, ivory, tea, sometimes men, and yet always returned to New York richer, darker, more distant. Children would run to the docks when his sails appeared on the horizon, shouting, "The Swan returns, the Swan returns." Women whispered about the ring he wore, gold, with a red stone that pulsed like a living heart. But the true magic was in the cargo. One chest might carry silk embroidered by the daughters of Shanghai nobility. Another, a painted fan that once cooled the neck of a Kyoto courtesan. The city's merchants would gather like priests around a relic, inspecting, weighing, appraising, transforming foreign wonders into the currency of power. And as the masts swayed gently against the twilight sky, one thing became clear. This city would not grow by land, but by sail. The counting houses. As the ships brought goods, the city needed places to measure, manage, and manipulate their worth. Thus rose the counting houses, low, timber-framed buildings where the true battles of empire were fought not with gunpowder, but with ink and ledgers. These rooms, dimly lit and lined with the scent of old paper and pipe smoke, became the crucibles of fortune. Inside, young clerks with ink-stained cuffs scribbled feverishly, their quills scratching out the lifeblood of trade, inventories, debts, contracts. Their hands moved in rhythm with the market's pulse, quickening with rumors of war, slowing during droughts in the Indies. They rarely saw the sun, yet could predict its effect on crops across the Atlantic by examining the slope of a chart. Men like Elias Mortimer, a quiet but ruthless accountant, held more power than most governors. With a single figure in a margin, he could collapse a rival's fortunes or conjure a sudden boom in the price of salt. He wore gray, spoke softly, and never bet on anything he could not calculate. His counting house on Hanover Square was rumored to have a secret vault, its ledgers guarded not by locks but by the fear he inspired in the city's most powerful men. It was in these spaces that fortunes were made invisible, converted from crates of coffee to scrawls in ledgers, and from there into mansions, influence, and even legislation. The counting house was not merely a place of arithmetic, it was an alchemical chamber where coin became control. At dusk, when the light angled through dusty windows, casting golden stripes across the tables, the clerks would pause their labor and glance at the skyline, at the sails, the smoke, and the towers rising steadily. They knew they were not merely recording history, they were creating it, one number at a time. Coffee, silk, and smuggled dreams. By the early 1700s, New York's wharves no longer only welcomed timber and fish. The city was awakening to a taste for luxury, aromas of roasted coffee beans, bolts of Chinese silk gleaming like water, and delicate porcelain from faraway lands. Yet not all of it arrived with royal permission. Beneath the surface of sanctioned trade, a shadow economy flourished. The smugglers came at night, their boats low and fast, hugging the coastline like whispers. Under cover of fog, crates were offloaded into hidden cellars beneath taverns and dry goods shops. There, the goods' fine Madeira wines, banned French lace, forbidden Dutch spices, passed silently into the hands of New York's wealthiest patrons, who paid in coin and silence. Young merchant Jacob Van Cleek, the son of a barrel maker, had risen quickly in these waters. He was handsome, articulate, and possessed a moral compass that pointed always toward opportunity. By day, he wore silk cravats and sipped coffee in the parlor of Stuyvesant Hall. By night, he negotiated with shadowy figures in back alleys, ensuring the city's hunger for the illicit was satisfied without delay. Smuggling was not simply crime, it was politics. British duties choked colonial trade, forcing men like Van Cleek to choose between loyalty to crown and loyalty to survival. In truth, the city was divided not by flags but by ledgers, those that showed duty paid and those that did not. Inside one cellar, lit only by a lantern swinging gently on a rusted hook, the mingling scents of tobacco, citrus, and gunpowder filled the air. Merchants spoke in hushed tones, fingers tracing maps where danger and wealth lay inches apart, and above them the city moved on, unaware, or pretending to be unaware, that its finest silks and richest coffees bore no king's seal. New York's identity as a mercantile empire was forged not only in sunlight and ceremony, but in fog and complicity. Smuggled dreams built parlor empires, and in every cup of coffee, every silken hem, lived a quiet rebellion. The governor's ball and the game of masks. As New York's merchant class swelled with gold and risk, so too did the pageantry of power. Each year the governor's ball was held in the Grand Hall of Fort Amsterdam, a stone fortress that had once been a humble Dutch outpost. Now, beneath its vaulted ceilings draped in velvet and candlelight, the city's elite gathered not only to dance, but to measure their influence in whispers and glances. The night was a symphony of powdered wigs, perfumed gloves, and silken gowns rustling like wind in a wheat field. Silver trays of candied almonds and spiced wine moved silently through the crowd. A string ensemble played sonatas from London, and each note seemed to echo off the high walls with rehearsed elegance. But beneath the civility, the ball was a stage for something else, a performance of masks, both literal and social. Here, traders who had just arranged illegal cargoes toasted the governor with feigned loyalty. Here, plantation owners flirted with widows of rival families, their eyes calculating dowries. And here, young Abigail Rutgers, daughter of a shipping magnate, danced gracefully with a British officer, all while hiding a note in her silk sleeve meant for a rebel sympathizer in New Jersey. The governor, regal in his navy coat stitched with gold thread, knew the hypocrisy well. He welcomed smiles from men who cursed his taxes, offered rum to merchants whose ships defied the crown's trade laws, and nodded politely to women whose letters supported the patriot cause. It was all a delicate theater, duty and deception woven into every gown and glove, and as the dance reels played into the night, no one dared let their masks slip. To do so was to lose more than dignity. It was to lose advantage. The governor's ball was not about loyalty. It was about balance between crown and colony, wealth and rebellion, illusion and survival. And in that elegant waltz, New York learned how to become an empire, not by brute force, but by playing both sides in a game only the clever survived. The tavern beneath the crown. While the governor's ball dazzled above, power brewed in the smoke-stained cellars beneath the city's cobbled streets. On a narrow lane off Broad Street stood the Crown and Anvil, a tavern older than most of the city's brickwork. Its wooden sign, swinging in the harbor wind, bore a faded crown cracked down the middle, a symbol some called accidental, others prophetic. Here, beneath low beams and flickering lanterns, the true pulse of colonial New York beat in muddy boots and slurred confessions. The air was thick with ale, sweat, and tobacco spiced by secrets. It was a place where sailors, smugglers, dockworkers, and even clerks came to speak freely. Once the mugs were full and the law was distant. At a far table beside a roaring hearth sat Willem Harrow, a former Dutch privateer turned merchant. His hands, scarred by rope and cutlass, now rested on ledgers instead of weapons, but his mind remained sharp. He spoke in riddles and half-truths, always listening more than speaking. And tonight he entertained two guests who did not belong, a Quaker in plain gray wool and a red-haired boy barely 16, trembling as he passed a letter under the table. The letter was from Boston. It spoke of taxes, tea, and tyranny. Harrow read it without expression, then slid it into his coat and raised his mug. "To trade," he said, "may it stay free." Around him no one looked twice. In this room loyalty was currency and allegiance shifted like tides. Some drank to the king, others to liberty, most drank simply to forget. The Crown and Anvil was more than a tavern, it was a fulcrum. It heard the dreams of rebellion before they became cries in the streets, and in the clink of mugs and murmur of songs, New York's future was quietly negotiated in the dark. Harbor of Secrets. By moonlight the harbor glistened like a sheet of beaten silver, rippling gently beneath the weight of whispers and cargo. As the city slumbered, the docks came alive, not with merchants and tariffs, but with those who thrived in the unseen crevices of empire. Smugglers, informants, and runaway indentured servants threaded through the labyrinth of crates and shadows like fish beneath ice. Near the edge of the East River, where the ships moored tightly like penned beasts, stood a narrow sloop named the Mercy Wind. Its sails were furled, but its deck was far from idle. A lean woman in a tricorner hat oversaw the unloading of unmarked crates, casks of Madeira, French silks, and paper-bound ledgers inked in Dutch. Her name was Sal Calderon, a former sugar clerk from Barbados who had learned the value of silence and timing. She dealt not in goods but in knowledge, shipping routes, tax codes, the movement of British regiments. Tonight she awaited a buyer not from the colonies but from across the sea, a man with powdered hair, gloves too clean for the waterfront, and a pocket watch bearing the royal crest. His presence meant only one thing: someone in London had begun to take notice of the colony's double life. "I've heard your crates speak louder than Parliament," he said, examining the contents with the tip of his cane. Sal smiled but said nothing. She gestured to a pouch of letters tied with hemp twine, sealed with wax marked not by a crown but a flame. These were not for sale, they were leverage. Quietly she slid them into his coat. "New York," she whispered, "has two faces. You're buying the one no one wears in daylight." As dawn approached and gulls circled above, the Mercy Wind slipped back into the fog, vanishing like a rumor. On shore, the city began to stir, ignorant of the transactions that would one day shape its revolution. The Dutch Ledger. Long before the British tongue ruled the streets of New York, the ink of the Dutch had already mapped its soul. In a private study above a brick counting house on Pearl Street, a ledger bound in cracked calfskin told a different history, one not of kings or crowns, but of barter, betrayal, and quiet ambition. It was not just a record of flour sold or beaver pelts tallied. Every page whispered stories. The purchase of a modest wharf in 1669 by a man named Jan van der Meer, who vanished a year later without a trace. A debt forgiven for a tavern keeper's daughter, whose initials appeared in curling ink beside a mysterious mark, a tulip faded and ghost-like. Entire entries written in cipher, as if the numbers themselves carried codes not meant for the king's men. The ledger had passed hands many times. Now it belonged to Avert ten Boom, a stern-faced clerk in his 40s with a passion for silence. He worked at night by candlelight, carefully updating the old book with entries from the new century. But he did not use ink alone. Beside him lay pigments and gold leaf, a custom of his great-grandfather, who once illuminated merchant ledgers like sacred texts. To Avert, trade was holy, each transaction a prayer, each risk a revelation. On this night, as rain tapped the panes like conspirators at his window, he added a name unfamiliar to history but destined for legend. Alexander Webb, a tobacco broker with no plantation and too much coin. The sum was vast, the cargo vague, the signature written in red. Avert paused, his quill hovered above the parchment, unsure whether he was recording commerce or conspiracy. The candle flickered. Somewhere beyond the window, bells chimed faintly from Trinity Church, counting out the hours of a city steadily selling its soul, not for gold, but for control. Harbor of Fortunes. At the edge of the island, where the East River kissed the bustling docks of the growing city, a storm of commerce never ceased. The harbor was alive, not with nature's voice, but with the song of ambition. Masts rose like skeletal cathedrals against the sky, their rigging whistling in the morning breeze. Hulls groaned under the weight of spice barrels, linen bales, and the weightier cargo of dreams. Men shouted in half a dozen tongues: Dutch, English, Lenape, French, even Portuguese. The port was a babel of purpose, each cry a thread in the great loom of trade. Cargo was hoisted by ropes creaking like strained sinew, and cartwheels groaned over cobblestone, churning the mud with the dust of far-off empires. Among them stood Susanna Rook, a widow with no title and yet a name whispered in the counting houses. Clad in a sea-blue cloak, she carried no coin purse, only a ledger tighter than any corset and a gaze sharp enough to weigh a bale at 20 paces. She was the silent partner behind one of the city's boldest ventures, a merchant fleet that bore no flag but profit. Susanna understood the tides better than any sailor. She knew when the Dutch sugar would flood the market and when English wool would fetch a king's ransom. Her men trusted her, for she risked more than coin, her reputation, her breath, her soul. She walked the docks that day not as a spectator, but as a sentinel. The ship Fortune's wake was late. Its delay was more than a nuisance, it was a harbinger. Rumors swirled of pirates near the Carolinas and of English privateers looking hungrily at Dutch cargoes. A storm brewed, not just in the Atlantic, but in politics, in ambition, in the trembling balance of old empires clashing over this new world. Susanna paused by a crate marked with Spanish glyphs. Her hand lingered on the wood as if listening for secrets in its grain. She whispered not a prayer but a price, and walked on, disappearing into the fog like a phantom of the harbor she ruled in silence. The counting houses. Beneath the steep gables of Broad Street, the counting houses breathed with a quiet intensity, their windows flickering with candlelight long after dusk fell over the city. It was not the roar of the docks or the chaos of ships that defined New York's new soul. It was here, in the rustle of parchment and the scratch of quills, that empires were weighed and born. Inside the narrow chamber of Jasper Van Hulst's office, the air smelled of ink, beeswax, and ambition. Tall ledgers lined the shelves, some bound in Dutch calfskin, others made of repurposed bark paper from the Lenape. Rows of numerals ran down columns like silent armies: guilder, pound, peso, florin, all currencies bent to the same god, profit. Jasper himself was a second son, clever, unreadable, and razor-sharp beneath a velvet waistcoat. His fingers were stained black from tallying debts and calculating futures. At 27 he had never raised a blade, yet he had conquered land and livelihood with nothing more than math and mischief. His mind was a compass, always pointing toward the next opportunity. That day across the desk from him sat a newcomer, Ezra Briggs, a Quaker merchant from Philadelphia with eyes full of grain and a tongue hesitant on gold. He came seeking credit to outfit 2 new schooners bound for Barbados, but Van Hulst's silence was not friendly. He did not trust idealists, nor did he trust men whose ledgers were cleaner than their fingernails. "You seek to buy time," Van Hulst murmured, sliding a blank promissory note toward Briggs. "Time costs more than sugar." Ezra fidgeted, his hands curling like sails in weak wind. "There's enough in the hold to cover risk tenfold." "And yet," said Van Hulst, "you carry no collateral but your word. Words, Mr. Briggs, cannot be seized when ships sink." Outside, the bells of Trinity Church tolled noon, muffled by the walls of wealth and cunning. Inside, the candlelight danced on Jasper's calculating gaze. He was not cruel, but he was not sentimental. Trade, to him, was not about fairness. It was about foresight, and only those who mastered the art of waiting could survive the tempest of fortune. Rum and revolving doors. By the time the afternoon sun slanted over the East River, the taverns of New York came alive, not with laughter but with negotiation. Beneath the smoke-blackened beams of the silver tankard on Dock Street, the real exchanges took place. It was a place of sawdust floors, naval tattoos, and cups that never stayed dry. Men called it a tavern, but it was far more. It was an unofficial exchange, a rumor mill, and sometimes a courtroom. The barkeep, Madge Kilpatrick, was older than she looked and sharper than she let on. With a tankard in one hand and a cutlass under the bar, she kept the peace with the authority of a governor and the precision of a priest. Around her spun a web of deals: Scottish fur traders, Portuguese rum barons, enslaved interpreters, runaway indentures, all drawn by the scent of molasses and money. At the far end, in a corner cloaked by pipe smoke, two figures leaned close. One wore the dark coat of a sea captain, buttons missing, eyes full of salt and secrets. The other, young and broad-shouldered, wore the fine blue coat of a Hudson agent, a junior trader flushed with confidence and perhaps ignorance. They haggled not over goods but over access. Access to wharves, to permits, to men who could be bought without paper trails. Outside, the city seemed polished, orderly, but in places like this, it revealed its second skin, brutal, brilliant, and unsupervised. The silver tankard was where fortunes were born and reputations lost, often in the same night. It was where the unspoken rules of trade were carved not into lawbooks but into hearts, scars, and whispers. Madge poured a measure of dark Jamaican rum, her voice cutting across the room. You want to swim with merchants, best learn how to hold your breath. And so, as night bled in through the warped windows, New York drank its way toward tomorrow, one deal, one lie, one revolution at a time. The paper behind the power. In the quiet hush of dawn, while the market still slumbered and the harbor was a mirror of gray mist, another sort of industry began its day, not with noise but with ink. Behind the polished door of a modest building on Wall Street, merchants gathered not around crates of goods but piles of parchment. This was the chamber of ledgers and contracts, the paper forge of empires. Here a man named Josiah Vredenburg held court. Neither noble nor soldier, Josiah was a clerk with fingers ink-stained and calloused from decades of transcription. His spectacles rested low on his nose, and his quill never stopped moving. He had never touched a musket nor crossed the Atlantic, yet his records commanded more respect than most governors. Stacks of trade bills, shipping manifests, and letters of marque passed through his hands, each one binding men together in obligations both invisible and unbreakable. His desk was a battlefield of alliances. One morning, a shipment of indigo; the next, a clause to ensure a voyage laden with West Indian sugar. He could tell the health of an empire by the thickness of its accounts. This was the new power, not steel but script, not swords but signatures. Outside, a young apprentice waited, scrolls clutched to his chest. He watched Josiah work, awed by the realization that the future of ships, fortunes, even wars, could begin with a single scratch of the quill. Josiah paused only to sip from a pewter cup of thick coffee, eyes scanning the fine print of a Dutch insurance document. A merchant's life, he murmured, is not in the goods he moves, but in the risks he survives. And as the sun rose over a city cloaked in ambition, New York's empire grew, not in battlefields but on paper, line by careful line. The Sugar Pact. Beneath the golden light of a spring morning, a merchant brig docked quietly at the East River wharves. Its timbers groaned under the weight of a precious cargo, molasses and raw sugar from the Caribbean, thick, dark, and fragrant, the lifeblood of the Atlantic trade. But this arrival was not simply another transaction. It marked the ratification of a pact months in the making. In a tall brick warehouse owned by the Delancey family, three men met behind closed shutters. Each man bore a different accent, Dutch, French, and English, but all spoke the universal tongue of commerce. They were brokers of a new world where sweetness came not from honey, but from hardship and wealth. Laid out before them was a parchment bearing signatures in looping ink, dotted with wax seals. The Sugar Pact was a private agreement, binding not just the shipment in port, but future loads from plantations in Antigua, Martinique, and Saint-Domingue. The numbers on the page sang promises of profit, if only the weather, pirates, and politics would cooperate. Outside, laborers unloaded barrels with care, rolling them down ramps onto wooden carts bound for distilleries and confectioners. To the common eye, it was merely cargo, but to those inside the warehouse, it was currency, leverage, and power. In the background, a young African boy, barefoot and wide-eyed, watched from the shadows. Sold as part of another shipment months prior, he now carried water for the workers. No one noticed him listening, but he heard it all: the names, the prices, the promises. In this city of trade, the sugar was sweet, but the silence around it was bitter. The Governor's Ball. As twilight deepened over the spired rooftops of colonial New York, the city held its breath for a spectacle of elegance and ambition: the Governor's Ball. Once a year, the mansion atop Bowling Green opened its gilded doors to the city's elite, drawing together merchants, military officers, fur barons, and foreign envoys in a glittering convergence of wealth and whispers. The ballroom gleamed with candlelight. Tall mirrors imported from London reflected tiers of crystal chandeliers, their flickering flames dancing like fireflies above powdered wigs and embroidered waistcoats. Musicians in livery struck the first chords of a minuet, their bows sweeping gracefully across violin strings as couples swept into motion on the polished oak floor. Governor William Cosby, draped in velvet and pride, stood at the center. His wife, Lady Cosby, adorned in a gown of rose silk, moved through the guests like a practiced duchess, her smile measured and razor-sharp. This was more than a ball, it was a performance of power. At the edge of the hall, a young merchant named Elias Carmichael, newly wealthy from his ventures in rum and tobacco, clasped a glass of Madeira. He watched the dancers not with envy but calculation. Who might he charm? Which hand might open the next trade route? Elsewhere, whispered conversations bloomed in curtained alcoves. A French attaché hinted at plans for fortifications upriver. A Dutch widow, sole heir to a shipping empire, entertained suitors with guarded smiles. Every bow, every curtsy, every glance was currency in motion. Outside the mansion, beyond the gated square, the city flickered in gaslight and smoke. Servants waited in carriages, beggars huddled near the stone fence, and sailors sang drunken sea shanties in nearby taverns. The music from within drifted over the garden hedges like perfume, sweet, distant, and unreachable. Inside, the ball would last until dawn. Outside, the world continued, unnoticed. Rum, sugar, and blood. The port of New York, with its masts stabbing the morning mist like needles, stood as a crucible of commerce and of conscience. Beneath the flapping flags of merchant vessels, barrels clattered onto the docks, sugar from the West Indies, molasses black as tar, and rum distilled in the alleys of the East River. The scent was sweet and sickly, masking the darker price paid in distant lands. Every crate bore more than cargo, it carried the weight of lives. The triangular trade had stitched the colonies into the great Atlantic web of profit. From the coasts of Africa, ships sailed heavy with human souls sold into bondage. From the Caribbean, the fruits of their labor arrived, sugarcane crushed by the enslaved, rendered into syrup and spirits. In New York, those goods were offloaded, repackaged, and sold again, filling taverns and treasury chests alike. Elias Carmichael, once a humble shopkeeper, now oversaw a counting house that grew richer with every ship he sent southward. His ledgers were immaculate, his conscience quieter than it had once been. The rum trade had gilded his door handles and furnished his parlors, but it had also aged his eyes. He no longer looked at his ships as marvels of timber and sail, but as vessels of necessity in a world that praised profit over peace. At the docks, free men worked beside indentured laborers and enslaved Africans, all bracing against the salt wind. A young boy, no older than 10, hoisted a rope alongside a man in chains, both paid in coin or suffering. A priest passed by, blessing neither. Overhead, a gull screamed like a spirit caught between heaven and the hold. The merchants gathered at France's tavern that evening, lifting glasses of dark rum to toast another prosperous voyage. Laughter rose above the clink of pewter. No one spoke of the sugar fields. No one mentioned the screams that had soaked into the wood of the ships. But history would remember. The northern sail. The March wind swept through the harbor with a whisper of salt and promise, as if the Atlantic itself carried tidings from the old world. On the shimmering surface of the Hudson River, bathed in the copper light of late afternoon, a formation of ships crept steadily into the bay, each adorned with the red, white, and blue stripes of the Dutch West India Company. These were not solitary vessels, but an organized fleet, arriving with purpose and precision, heralding the start of another trading season. People gathered along the wooden piers, not merely to gaze, but to listen to the creak of hulls, the calls of sailors, the song of commerce that had become the city's lifeblood. Each sail brought more than goods. They brought opportunity, gossip, gold, and the breath of Amsterdam itself. The northern sails, bold and stately, carried with them an invisible force far greater than wind, economic dominion, stretching across the ocean like a second empire. In the Broad Street Exchange, the Dutch merchants had already gathered beneath low beams and flickering lanterns. The scent of pipe smoke hung in the air as they leaned over ledgers and glasses of spiced rum. Agreements had been drafted before the ships had even breached the horizon. Now, it was merely a matter of signatures and seals, of confirming the flow of goods and the quiet consolidation of power. I remember Hendrik van Loon, a man who never raised his voice and never needed to. Cloaked in a black wool coat embroidered with fine silver thread, he was the quiet storm of the city's trade. When the ships arrived, he appeared not as a spectacle but as certainty. People stepped aside not out of fear but reverence. He was not the wealthiest nor the most flamboyant, but he understood the ocean's language better than anyone. With every incoming vessel, his reach lengthened. The northern sails, you see, were more than fabric and timber. They were flags of intent. They declared to the world that New York was no longer merely a colonial outpost, but a contender in the great mercantile ballet of nations. And like a patient predator, it had begun to take its place among empires, ship by ship. The counting house. Behind a narrow red brick facade on Pearl Street stood one of the city's most peculiar sanctuaries, not a church but a counting house. It lacked stained glass and sacred hymns, yet within its walls, men congregated daily with a quiet reverence that rivaled any chapel. The scent of aged parchment and beeswax polish filled the room, mingling with the subtle tension of wealth in motion. Here, clerks sat hunched over long ledgers, their quills scratching methodically across pages that held more power than any musket. It was in these books, bound in calfskin and secured in iron chests, that the lifeblood of the city pulsed, debts owed, barrels of sugar shipped, crates of fur sold, land purchased, fortunes staked. No shouting was permitted, business was sacred, and numbers divine. At the center of it all stood Mr. Ilias Tenbroek, the senior bookkeeper, his hair powdered and tied, his waistcoat immaculate, his gaze unwavering. With a flick of the wrist, he could determine whether a merchant would prosper or fail. He knew every name on every page, not just as entries but as stories. A ship lost to storm, a widow investing her late husband's estate, a fur trapper who rose from nothing. These were more than transactions. They were pieces of a growing empire. It was whispered that the British envied how precise the Dutch kept their books, how cleanly they tracked every coin. And indeed, it was this hidden discipline, this quiet arithmetic, that separated New York from other colonial towns. Where others trafficked in instinct and luck, this city sharpened its teeth on numbers. Ilias would often say, a port without records is just a dock, but a dock with books is a kingdom. And in that narrow counting house, under candlelight and columns of ink, a kingdom was indeed being born, not of crowns and armies, but of agreements, cargo, and credit. The auction bell. At the southern end of Wall Street, beneath the shade of a twisted elm, there stood a small wooden platform, unremarkable in size, yet mighty in consequence. It was here that the auction bell rang, each clang echoing through the cobbled lanes like a signal flare to merchants, brokers, and opportunists alike. When the bell tolled, time seemed to compress. Horses halted, conversations paused mid-sentence, and men adjusted their coats as they made their way toward the platform. The crowd was never uniform. Furriers rubbed shoulders with sugar dealers, tobacco traders stood beside financiers. It was an uneasy fellowship, held together not by kinship, but by the magnetism of commerce. A tall man named Malcolm Rivington served as auctioneer. With a voice that could cut through wind and fog, he read aloud each lot with a theatrical flourish: 10 hogsheads of molasses from Martinique, or 1 chest of Calcutta indigo, unopened. Beside him, his assistant lifted the merchandise for all to see, even if it was just a bolt of cloth or a battered crate marked with foreign script. But it wasn't always goods that were sold. There were days, uncomfortable, whisper-laden days, when what stood on the platform was not cargo but people. Enslaved souls brought from distant shores, auctioned beside barrels of tobacco as though their worth could be measured in coin. Some in the crowd averted their gaze, others leaned forward with cold calculation. It was a contradiction the city lived with, trade and brutality intertwined like rope and sail. I remember once a silence fell after the bell rang, when a child was led forward to be sold. Even Rivington's voice faltered for a breath, but the sale went on. Always the sale went on. This, too, was part of the empire. The platform remained long after the auction ended, quiet again, unassuming. Yet it had become a symbol of something undeniable, that beneath every ledger and contract there beat a heart of ambition, tireless and complex, capable of both building and breaking. The coffee house murmurs. At the corner of Stone and Bridge Street stood a narrow building of 2 stories, its front windows fogged with the heat of conversation and pipe smoke. Within its oak-paneled walls, the city's pulse beat steadily, not through shouts or hammers, but in murmurs. This was the Exchange Coffee House, and if the docks were the muscles of the trade empire, then this was surely its mind. It was no grand establishment, nothing like the coffee palaces of London, but what it lacked in grandeur it made up for in intimacy. The tables were close, the fire burned low, and every man who entered knew that information here traveled faster than wine through sails. Sugar prices in Barbados, the mood of Parliament in London, rumors of French aggression up the St. Lawrence, all passed from ear to ear before making it to the newspapers, if they made it at all. The regulars wore the uniform of influence, wool coats faded at the edges, ink-stained cuffs, and eyes sharp with calculation. Some were shipowners, others were brokers, but many were simply listeners, those who understood that in this city, power belonged not to those who shouted the loudest, but to those who heard the whispers first. I remember the figure of Mr. Addison Green, never spoke above a hush, never touched his drink until it had gone cold. He would sit by the window, hands folded, absorbing everything. On a quiet day, he might speak only once and still walk out with the knowledge of 3 new shipping ventures, a debt collection rumor, and the impending collapse of a small Dutch insurer. He was not alone. There were dozens like him, ghosts of the market, whose fortunes rose and fell with no more noise than a stirred spoon. The empire that was rising did not rest solely on ships or coin, but on breath, on murmured deals made over coffee and clove, in the quiet war of intellect and instinct. The widow's ledger. Not all fortunes in New York were born of fleets and fur. Some were built in silence, behind drawn curtains and candlelight. In a narrow townhouse just off Hanover Square lived a woman known simply as the Widow Van Wyck. She rarely appeared in public save for the Sabbath. Yet in the ledgers of the city's traders her initials, WVW, appeared with uncanny regularity, scribbled beside large sums and delicate terms. She had inherited a modest shipping enterprise after her husband's sudden death at sea, but where most widows might have sold off the assets or handed the work to male relatives, she did something else entirely. She studied, she listened, she waited. And then she traded. She never set foot aboard a ship nor shouted across any auction block. Her empire was built through letters, dozens dispatched each week by hand to captains, insurers, brokers, and foreign agents. Every contract bore her seal, a scarlet wax stamp in the shape of a compass rose. To many, it became a symbol of quiet precision. Men scoffed at first, some refused to do business with her, others tried to cheat her. None succeeded. By the third year, her ships were running Caribbean routes faster than most. By the fifth, she held majority stakes in 2 counting houses and partial ownership of a grain mill north of Albany. Her profits flowed not from risk, but from the shrewd refusal to rush. She waited for panic in others, then bought. She waited for greed, then sold. And though she owned fine dresses and pearl hairpins, she rarely wore them. Her wealth was not a spectacle. It was an instrument, a slow, deliberate force shaping the contours of the city from behind a veil of modesty. I recall once overhearing 2 merchants debating a cargo of indigo. One scoffed, "Wait for the widow's move." The other nodded, "She always knows." In a world ruled by loud men and louder ships, hers was the quietest assent of all, written in ink, sealed in wax, whispered in corners, yet undeniable. The harbor at dusk. As the sun dipped low behind the Palisades, the harbor became a living painting, its rippling waters catching the last amber light like coins scattered upon silk. Ships bobbed gently at anchor, their rigging silhouetted against the darkening sky, while gulls cried overhead as if bidding farewell to the day's commerce. Evening in the port was its own ceremony. The urgency of the day gave way to ritual, ropes coiled with care, crates sealed with pitch, manifests checked and double-checked by lantern glow. On the docks, dockhands shared bread and cider, their laughter low and hoarse, like old sails flapping in the wind. But for the seasoned traders who stood at the edge of the quay, hands behind their backs, eyes toward the water, dusk was not a closing. It was an assessment. You could tell much from the stillness of a hull, the way a crew descended the gangplank, heavy with silver or light with empty holds. You could watch the tide's color and know how far upriver the silt had traveled. And if you listened closely, you could hear more than footsteps or waves. You could hear the language of empire forming in the hush between bells. One evening I stood beside an aging captain, his face carved by salt and wind. He watched a brigantine glide toward its berth and murmured, "There's Spanish coin in her belly. I can smell Seville on the canvas." He wasn't wrong. The harbor at dusk was no mere port. It was an oracle, if you knew how to read it. To the untrained eye it was quiet, to the merchant's soul it sang. The mapmaker's lamp. Tucked away in a crooked alley behind Broad Street, where the smell of ink and seawater mingled with the dust of old parchment, there worked a man whose name rarely crossed the lips of merchants, yet whose handiwork guided every voyage and venture. They called him simply Leclerc, a quiet Frenchman of uncertain origin who spoke little and charged much. His shop bore no sign, save for a brass compass nailed to the lintel. Inside it was a temple of cartography, every wall hung with maps in various stages of becoming, some fresh with pencil lines, others browned and brittle from the heat of a dozen lamps. By night the city's traders and shipmasters would knock softly at his door, slipping inside to study coasts they'd never seen. Jamaica, Suriname, Senegal. Leclerc's maps held more than lines, they held currents, wind patterns, rumors. A crescent bay here, a hidden reef there. He was a collector of whispers, translating sailors' tailies and tobacco-stained fingers into navigational truth. It was said he'd never left Manhattan, yet knew the shape of the Indies better than those who had circled it thrice. He listened more than he asked, sketching as men spoke, pausing only to refill his quill or trim the wick of his lamp. His tools were humble, a brass divider, an ivory-handled knife, a compass with a cracked glass face, but the precision of his work was unmatched. When a ship failed to return, captains whispered they didn't use Leclerc. It was half joke, half article of faith. I visited him once. He offered no greeting, just handed me a rolled map with